We include risk when we're working on our portfolio. In fact, we do a model every year that looks at our emissions versus the investments and versus the returns. And then what we're trying to do over time is ensure that we're putting our dollars that not only create the most value for our shareholders, but lower our climate risk. And we're doing things to mitigate our climate risk. Some of the things we're doing are ensuring that the emissions from our operations are the lowest possible that they can be, applying not just best practices today, but trying to develop new technologies that will help us lower emissions within our own operations. In addition to that, we're working on technologies that will also lower our carbon footprint. And as you know, we have a target to be net zero on carbon. Our aspiration is to do that by 2050. We have some interim targets that we're going to achieve as well. And that's all important for us because we believe that it's to be a sustainable oil and gas company for the future, that to have very, very strict goals around how we invest our dollars, how we manage our emissions, and to get to net zero from a carbon perspective is an absolute must do.
Well, precisely, you've announced in 2020 that you're targeting net zero by 2050 on all three scopes. Scope 1 and 2 will basically depend on some of the technologies that you're working on that you just mentioned, and you want to net zero in on that in 2040. But let's talk about Scope 3 emissions, which are the hardest part of all three scopes. You want to net zero that by 2050. How's that possible?
Well, that's what differentiates Oxy from some of the other oil and gas companies, is that we are developing a technology called direct air capture. We have invested in carbon engineering, which developed the technology. We will apply the technology, and as well as being a part owner of the company. What it does is it gives us the opportunity to extract CO2 out of the atmosphere. And by doing that, we can not only address our own emissions to become net zero from a carbon perspective, we can give the people, the companies, the corporations, and other industries the opportunity to also become net zero. That's how we address our Scope 3, because as you know, Scope 3 are the products that are made from and the emissions created as a result of the use of our products. So unlike others, now direct air capture gives us the opportunity to zero out the Scope 3.
For carbon capture and storage to pick up globally, do you think there needs to be an agreement on a carbon price globally?
I think that would be almost impossible to do. It's difficult enough for individual countries to come to some agreement on how to tax carbon or how to put a price on carbon. I do believe that within regions that the market itself will drive the price of carbon. Because in the United States, what we're finding is as soon as we announced our direct air capture and that we were going to build it, we started getting calls from corporations that want to address their own emissions and want to become net zero carbon. And so the interest from those corporations indicates that over time they will pay to reduce their emissions and or their carbon footprint. So I think that naturally there will be a CO2 credit market driven.
What are Oxy's interim and medium targets for carbon capture and storage capacity?
We have tremendous capacity. We have, in the Permian Basin, we not only have 3 reservoirs currently permitted for carbon capture and sequestration, we're looking at getting additional permits and expanding beyond the Permian. So we have sufficient capacity in several different states to be able to address where the carbon is stored.
Do you have a number on that in terms of tons?
Oh, it's tremendous. I would say that right now the Permian Basin itself can store at least 50 gigatons. Mm-hmm. And we're a big operator and owner of subsurface rights in the Permian.
Oxy wants to become a carbon management company in the future. Other than enhanced oil recovery, what other uses for CO2 are you working on?
We're working on a process that could convert CO2 to bioethylene. We've actually tested it in the lab and it works. The company that we have invested in that is doing this is Cemvita, that's located in Houston. That process would not only help us have another use for CO2, but it would help our chemicals industry that uses a lot of ethylene. So that's another way that we can address emissions from a different part of our organization.
How would you respond to those who say that the world can't continue business as usual in the hope that technologies such as carbon capture can reach maturity and that won't happen probably in time to help decarbonize the industry?
I would say that the oil and gas industry cannot continue as usual. We have to change who we are, and what we do. That's essential. But it will be through technology. I disagree with anyone who says that we can't develop technology that works. We've been handling CO2 for 40 years in the Permian Basin for enhanced oil recovery. We're the largest handler of CO2 for enhanced oil recovery in the world. So we know that technology can work. We are today separating CO2 from hydrocarbon gases. We can separate it from air. We can separate it from flue gas. We use amine processes, we use membranes, and now we're going to use a different process with direct air capture. The technology is there, it just needs to be further developed, and we need to be able to lower the cost. And I believe that we will lower the cost as well as wind and solar did. Back when wind and solar started, everybody said it's too expensive, it's never going to work. Now wind and solar have reduced their cost by 70 and 80% respectively over the past 15 years. We can do the same with the technologies we need for carbon capture, use, and sequestration. It will happen, and it has to happen. And because it has to happen, we can make it happen. The oil and gas industry has innovated for centuries.
What's your take on COP26 in Glasgow to the matters that relate to the energy industry?
Well, I think it's a positive that there was so much interest this year. 40,000 people registered. I think you made the comment that 30,000 were there when you were there. I was there the second week, not so many there were there that week. But I would say that there were also a lot more business leaders. In the past, it's been mostly environmental ministers, it's been scientists and activists. Now there were a lot of CO2s there. CEOs, I'm sorry. There were a lot of CEOs that attended the conference, and they came from the perspective that we need to collaborate together. And so I think there were that was a lot of positive information, I think, and positive experience there. The one negative from COP26 is that the oil and gas industry didn't really have a seat at the table. And that's why I'm so excited that COP28 will be here in Abu Dhabi. I think that will help to give us a voice, because we are going to need to be a part of the solution. We cannot cap global warming to 1.5 degrees without the oil and gas industry being very involved, because we have the know-how to make it happen.
Finally, many in the shale plays in the US had to restrain production in the past 2 years or so in order to pay down debt or return some cash to shareholders and investors. Will shale production restraint continue, in your opinion, given that oil prices are over $80 a barrel?
I think that it always makes sense to match supply and balance supply with demand. So I think it really depends on the demand. We don't want to oversupply the market. We want to make sure that what we produce matches what the needs are. And so I think it really depends on that. And by restraint, it's people, when they talk about restraint or they talk about discipline, what they really, the investment community really means a lot of times is just keep production where it is today. That is not going to work if demand continues to increase, because then that will drive prices higher. And so to balance what consumers have to pay for the products that come from oil and gas development, they need us to meet that demand. And so I think it really depends on what happens in the markets.
Ms. Vicky Holub, thank you very much for taking the time and being with us.
Thank you.